The other part of this that's interesting and worrying is that we're in the Me Too era right now, which is an era of heightened concern about sexual harassment and sexual violence towards women. And although that started in the U.S., I think Europe is just as much experiencing the Me Too moment, from what I hear. And this, on one level, it seems like the problem you're taking aim at in this book should fit right into the ethos of Me Too. Yet people who are sort of loudly a part of the Me Too movement wouldn't go near this issue and would probably despise you or at minimum disagree with your take on this. So can you talk a little bit about that strange dynamic?
Very strange dynamic. Yes. And there are 2 points I want to make on that. One is that the women who are affected right now are mainly working class women. And the reason is because immigrants start off at the lowest income levels. Basically, they depend on the state for their income. They are put in these working class neighborhoods. And some of these neighborhoods are populated by the people who traditionally voted for center-left parties. Center-left parties have abandoned these voters and are now counting on the immigrant vote. And these are the immigrants who are naturalized citizens and who can't vote. But a second point is that the perpetrators largely are immigrant men, and they're considered minorities. Minorities are vulnerable. They come from, as we discussed earlier, broken down societies. They've gone through a lot of suffering, so people feel sorry for them. And so if the Me Too movement were to start condemning immigrant perpetrators the way they condemn, say, white men, they would see themselves as punching down. Like, these guys are already vulnerable. They have low income. So people get confused morally by these issues. And this is a self-inflicted problem, because you can say, I condemn sexual violence regardless of who the perpetrator is. Or you can say, you know what, we're just going to focus on the wealthy, white, powerful men. And if you do that, de facto, you're then protecting the wealthy, white victims, because, and then, maybe unwittingly, you have a class distinction now. Working class women victims have no one speaking for them. And the men from whom they fear, these men are also seen as victims. And so you get this crazy dynamic where, in my view, the most vulnerable victims, immigrant women and working class women, are abandoned.
Yeah, and just to put a sharp point on how different the attitude is depending on whether you are, say, a working class person in one of these neighborhoods you describe, or if you're someone like me at Columbia. I remember taking a sexual assault survey and at Columbia a few years ago, and one of the questions asked if you had ever declined to have sex with someone and their response was to get a little bit angry. And if you answered yes to that question, it counted you as a victim of sexual assault. Right. And by that definition, I have been sexually assaulted. And I remembered flagging this and trying to talk about it, but there was just, right, this was just, it was completely, so that's how sensitive, that's how broad the definitions of sexual assault have gotten in these elite spaces, largely populated by wealthy and privileged people.
Yeah.
And on the flip side of the coin, you have police departments in Europe turning a blind eye in some cases for years to actual rape of, in some cases, children, because it's so uncomfortable, the fact that the people who happen to be committing these crimes happen to be immigrants and happen to be brown.
And I bet you it's no different in America, because the Me Too movement doesn't go that far. It doesn't protect vulnerable communities, because in those communities, the perpetrators are part of those communities. So I bet you they don't have those questionnaires in certain areas in LA or Chicago or New York or you name it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is this paradox where what my friend Christina Hofsommers describes as a fainting couch feminism, where young women in Ivy League universities, super privileged, see themselves as victims. And when we talk about victimization, it's just as you said, it's not, that they've really been physically assaulted or anything like that. It is maybe someone makes a clumsy joke or even says something like, these days, there's so much policing around language that you can claim you're traumatized as a woman by what someone says or thinks or how someone looks at you. And we don't seem to be paying any attention to real assault, real physical assault, which and rapes and gang rapes. So in Europe, it's not even, when I was doing research for this work, there are all these distinctions that are made: rape by an acquaintance, rape by a spouse, and then by strangers, and then the number of people who take part in that. And if you look at the most extreme form of sexual violence, it's happening. We're even failing to document it, let alone go after the perpetrators and punish it. And if you refuse to document it, then that means that's also a choice. It also means you accept that these things go on. And so maybe in a way, it's easier for people to focus on these non-problems, because that way they think they're doing something about sexual violence. But they're infantilizing women, they're infantilizing powerful, privileged, well-educated women, and completely ignoring what's happening to vulnerable women in vulnerable communities.
There was one woman you interviewed in the book who described, and this also leads to another big topic for the book, which is the retreat of women from certain public spaces as a result of feeling unsafe. So there's one woman you interviewed that was testifying to no longer walking through a certain park in her town and so forth, and now carrying pepper spray to avoid harassment. And you write in the book, I got the sense she almost wished that they were white Germans harassing her so that the problem would be easier to discuss.
Yes. And she wasn't the only one. There were so many of them who said it would have been so much easier if they were just the local white guys, because the outrage would be tremendous. But because it's immigrant men, refugees, asylum seekers, men and young men who come from vulnerable communities, these women are left to the, I would say, outside of the rule of law. And so what they've done, those who could afford, is to move house. They would find a place in a better, safer neighborhood. Others adapted, and I find that in some ways chilling. They adapt by adopting the same survival tactics as immigrant Muslim women. They would cover themselves. They would seek, when they leave their houses, go out in crowds, like 2, 3, 4, maybe call a male relative and say, can you walk me from here to there? They gave up things like jogging or dining out or even being out after dark. Now, in some of these countries in the winter, it gets dark at 4 p.m. So these women are adjusting in these ways or deciding, tonight I'm not going out, I'll just stay in. And this is precisely when I lived in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. I just remember that's how we lived. That's how we survived. If you're a young woman and you didn't want to get into trouble, it would all be your fault. So to avoid all of that, you just stayed at home and you abide by the rules of not getting yourself into trouble. Why is this chilling? Because if you look at the history of women's rights and women's emancipation, the public space being safe for women, there are really only very few societies that have actually accomplished that, and even not 100% still. And those societies are, Northern European countries, parts of the US. And the idea was always the rest of the world is going to adapt. Women will see their rights expand and their freedoms expand. And now it's the opposite. European women are adapting in their own countries to the norms, some of the norms of immigrant men that come from misogynist societies. And that is a backwardness for women. And feminists are silent on this. I know they're screaming over the rooftops on the MeToo issues, but on this, they're silent. And I think this has more, for the future, I think this is going to be more defining than the Harvey Weinsteins of this world.